All right, thank you all for coming. It's awesome that we're able to put on this event given this year's circumstances. So we're really grateful to the university and all the organizations that helped make this possible. My name is Matthew Romer. I'm the president of the RSO facilitating this event, Ratio Christi. The name is Latin for the reason of Christ. Ratio Christi is a national Christian apologetics organization, which we are a local chapter of, that provides university students with historical, philosophical, and scientific reasons to believe that Christianity is true. After all, the word apologetics doesn't mean to apologize for something, but it means to give a defense for our position. We just discuss the nature of truth and morality, arguments for the existence of God, and the historicity of the Bible. Tonight's event will be a dialogue on the topic of God and morality, and what is the best account of objective morality. I am joined by two guest speakers on stage who I will now introduce. Dr. Erik Wielenberg is professor of philosophy at DePauw University. He earned his PhD from the University of Massachusetts and spent a year studying at the Center for Philosophy of Religion at the University of Notre Dame. He has authored 3 books in ethics and the philosophy of religion, including Robust Ethics, the Metaphysics and Epistemology of Godless Normative Realism, published by Oxford University Press. Our other speaker is Dr. Adam Johnson. He serves with Ratio Christi, a university ministry, and teaches for the Rhineland School of Theology in Wilmersdorf, Germany, and Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri. He earned his PhD at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. He is the editor of the book God and Morality, published by Routledge, and his work has been published in several peer-reviewed academic journals. So in 2018, both were involved in a debate on a similar topic, with William Lane Craig debating Erik Wielenberg, with Adam Johnson as the moderator. We are selling that book, or the book form of that debate right over there, and that will be available after the event. And that will also include additional arguments from the speakers beyond the original debate. So please join me in welcoming our guests. Okay, there we go. All right, still here? Okay. So tonight will be broken up into 3 sections. I will start with some introductory questions for our speakers to explain their positions. Then they'll have a chance to ask each other questions, and then finally we'll have a Q&A session at the end. If you have a question, you can scan the QR code. Wesley, can you bring up the QR code? There we go. If you scan that, you can submit a question or upvote other questions that are on that webpage. We will use those questions submitted throughout the evening in the final section of the event. All right, well, let's begin with the first session. So, and I'll let Adam start, and we can go back and forth. How do you two know each other? Let's begin with that.
Yeah, so when I started my PhD research, 2013, I started a PhD in philosophy, and I knew I wanted to do something in moral philosophy. So I was looking for, some new voices and some things that were going on in moral philosophy or meta-ethics. And I came across Erik Wielenberg's book, the one he mentioned, Robust Ethics. And at the time, it was brand new and it was only available in the UK. I don't know if you'll remember this, but I reached out to you at that time and said, boy, I'd really love to write my first PhD paper on your new book, but it's not available here in the States yet, only in the UK. So I reached out to you to see if you had one available, and you pointed me to how I could get one from the UK, order one from the UK. So I did so, and that began just an introduction Two, my understanding of Erik's theory of objective morality. And I wrote my paper that semester, my first semester in my PhD program, on Erik's theory, and it got published in an academic journal. So I sent it to him, and that just began a conversation. I believe that was 2014, and he was very kind and responded and gave me some encouragement and some feedback on what I wrote. And that just began a conversation that's been going on now for several years, where him and I have been talking about this issue, and now we got a chance to write that book together. And I coordinated that debate between him and William Lane Craig, Christian philosopher, a couple of years ago. So it was through that process is how we got to meet and know one another. And I just appreciate his work, and I appreciate his friendship and encouragement over the years as I've been studying and working in this field of metaethics, moral philosophy.
That pretty much covers it. The only thing I would add is our relationship went to the next level today when Adam took me to Runza for the first time. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think I don't know much. That does the trick.
Sweet. What did you think of the Runzas?
Yeah, quite good. Yeah.
He's moving to Nebraska next week.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the next question. What do you two agree on? And Erik, can we have you start off?
Okay, so yeah, I think probably the most important thing that we agree, for this discussion, the most important thing we agree on is the reality of objective morality, of a real right and wrong, good and evil, that is independent of human beliefs and moral practices, at least to a certain degree. So I think maybe a basic way of just saying a bit about this concept of objective morality is actually to think about objective truth outside of the context of ethics and morality. And fortunately, I have a nice prop here. So here's a water bottle, which is sitting on this table. Now, if you've taken a philosophy class, you hang out with philosophers, you might know that some people would even object at this point. But we're going to ignore those people for now, and we're going to assume, for the sake of argument, which I think is a plausible assumption, that there really is a water bottle sitting on the table here. And the fact that the water bottle is on the table is objective in a certain way. And what that means is it's not that it's true just because we all think that it's true. It's not just a matter of our cultural practices. There's something that makes it the case that there's a water bottle sitting on the table. And in fact, I think if all of us went crazy and became convinced there was no water bottle, or if we were all actually killed in some way that did not disturb the water bottle, it would remain true that the water bottle was on the table. So its truth is sort of out there, independent of human minds in the world, you might say. And so if that part makes sense, then I think the idea of objective morality is just that there are some truths about right and wrong, good and evil. Maybe not all of them, but at least some of them that have that same kind of objectivity. I think they're probably not physical facts, but they have that same sort of independence of human minds, human beliefs, human cultural practices. So that would be my attempt to give a rough characterization of objective morality. And I think Adam and I both agree that such a thing is real. We just disagree on the small matter of where it comes from, I think.
Yeah, and I would affirm that. I mean, that's what, I guess, attracted me to his theory in the first place was his firm conviction, his belief, his theory does affirm objective morality. And I think that comes as a surprise to theists or Christians often because in the past, a lot of atheists affirmed more of a relative or a subjective morality. And there's still a lot of people that do affirm that, but definitely at the academic level, there are a lot more atheists now who are affirming and arguing for objective morality, which I'm greatly pleased by. I agree with that, that morality is objectively true, or sometimes it's called moral realism. I think you would be comfortable with that term too, right? Mm-hmm. Moral realism. So I'm thankful for that. But as he said, where we would disagree then is, well, if there is such a thing as objective moral truth, then where does it come from? What's the best account or what's the best explanation of this objective moral truth? The other thing that I would say to the question of what we have in common is, another thing is kind of our epistemological principles of how we should best ascertain the truth here, or how we should best try to discover what is actually true about reality. And so both of us would affirm that the right way to go about this would be, plausibility or reasonability. So using our reason, we want to base our beliefs, all of our beliefs, whether they're scientific, historical, religious, philosophical, all of our beliefs should be based on good reasons and evidence. And I think him and I would both affirm that. In fact, I'd like to promote one of his books that I really enjoyed, a book that he wrote, Erik Wielenberg here wrote, called God and the Reach of Reason. And in this book, he puts C.S. Lewis, David Hume, and Bertrand Russell together in conversation. And I thought it was very, very useful, and I enjoyed the book greatly, because one of the things that Erik affirms in there is stuff that C.S. Lewis affirmed, that even our religious beliefs should not be blind, irrational leaps of faith, but should be based on good reasons and evidence. And from talking with Erik over the years, it definitely is clear to me that he's a fan of C.S. Lewis, disagrees with C.S. Lewis on many issues, of course, but appreciates that aspect of C.S. Lewis at least, and teaches classes through and about C.S. Lewis, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Awesome. Next question is, why do you believe that morality is objective and real? Maybe you could begin by explaining what it means for morality to be objective and real, if that hasn't already been mentioned yet.
And who goes first? I forget.
Adam, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think Erik did a good job already kind of explaining what we mean when we say that morality is objectively real. So we want to say that there are objective moral truths, like rape is wrong, that exist or are true objectively, no matter what we think, feel, or believe about it. So a classic example is, if somehow somebody put something in our water or made us all take pills so that tomorrow morning we all woke up and thought that rape was morally okay, morally acceptable. Well, would that make it so? And if somebody affirms moral realism, or that moral truth is objectively real, they would reject that. They would say, no, even if we all woke up tomorrow thinking that rape was okay, that wouldn't make it okay, because it exists in some way, shape, or form as an objective truth that isn't impacted by how we think, feel, or our personal subjective opinions about it. So there's good arguments out there for that. In fact, we're thinking of trying to coordinate a debate on that particular issue. That's not the debate tonight, because both of us agree on objective morality, but there's possibly a debate we're going to put together among students on this particular issue here at UNL, whether moral truth exists objectively or if morality is just a pure subjective thing. So in a debate like that, the folks that would be arguing for objective morality would have to make their case for it. And we won't do that in depth tonight because, as we said, Erik and I both agree to that. But I think the way to go about making a case for it is to build an argument like anything. And it's going to work different than a historical argument or a scientific argument, evidences. You're going to be making the case philosophically. You're going to be using different things to build your case. But I think it goes back to plausibility. So what's the most plausible theory? Objective morality versus subjective morality. And I would say, since I only just got a few seconds left, one of the best arguments out there, sustained philosophical arguments for objective morality, can be found in this book by David Enoch. And Enoch, as far as I understand, is an atheist. His theory is definitely not a theistic theory, but in this book published by Oxford University Press, David Enoch makes an excellent case, and even a lot of Christians agree, probably the best case in the philosophical literature for believing in objective morality. So this would be a book that I would recommend for a more sustained, longer argument for morality being objectively true.
Yeah, so I would add maybe, here are two perhaps lines of thought, pretty simple, in favor of objective morality. I mean, I think one thing that makes objective morality seem plausible to me is simply thinking about examples. And I think when you think about right and wrong, there are some cases where what's right and wrong does seem to be somewhat dependent on culture. So like, which side of the road should I drive on, morally speaking? It depends what country you're in. And I think if you focus on examples like that, that's the kind of thing that can make you start to think, well, it's all relative, or just depends on your culture. If you're in the US, you should be driving on the right, probably. If you're in the UK, probably on the left. But if you think about something like, okay, would it be okay to torture an infant just for fun? Just that example suggests to me there's a determinate answer, and it doesn't really matter what country you're in or what the cultural practices happen to be. The answer is no, you shouldn't do that, morally speaking. And there seem to be cases like that where it certainly seems as if there's an objective fact of the matter. And without some decisive or at least pretty compelling argument or evidence or reason to reject that things are the way that they seem, it seems like we ought to go with the way things, we have to accept that things are in fact the way that they seem. So that's one line of argument, pretty straightforward. Another one, only slightly less straightforward, is if you think about, people often criticize one another on the basis of how they form their beliefs. You shouldn't believe that because you don't have evidence for it, or you're being irrational, and so on. And if you think about those sorts of debates, it seems very rare for people to see that as just a relative matter. So what I mean is, if you believe that the sky is going to turn orange tomorrow on the basis of something a Ouija board told you, that probably isn't a good reason for reaching that conclusion. And I think most people would look at that and say, yeah, this is just objectively not a proper way of reasoning. But how we ought to reason has the same kind of normativity to it. It's telling us what, we ought to do this thing, we ought to think that way, ought not to think this other way. And that's very similar to morality. Maybe it's not exactly the same, but I think a thing that's common to rationality and morality is the sense that they have oughtness to them. There's a way you should do it, a way you shouldn't do it. And they seem to stand or fall together. And so another line of argument would simply be, if you think that there's objectivity when it comes to how to think, why shouldn't there also be objectivity when it comes to what to do, morally speaking? So that would be a second, I guess, line of argument in favor of objective morality.
Could you both briefly explain the historical context of your positions? And Eric, can I have you start?
I'm going first this time? Okay, so maybe I should mention what perhaps is obvious but hasn't been stated yet, I think, which is that Adam holds that you need God, a particular kind of God, as the foundation or the basis of objective morality, whereas I disagree. So I think the situation is we agree on the reality of this thing, objective reality, but then when it comes to this question of, okay, what's its foundation? Where does it come from? How is it that the universe or reality can contain these objective facts about right and wrong? That's where I think the disagreement arises. Adam thinks they need a theistic foundation. I think that they don't. So I favor an approach to objective morality that basically says objective morality has its own foundation. There's going to be some group of basic moral principles or axioms that are the bottom level, and they really have no further explanation or source that makes them true. They're kind of the starting point. So an analogy might be if you think about geometry. You've got your axioms, and then you use your axioms to have lots of fun and derive theorems. But you don't prove the axioms, you just start with them and assume them. And they seem to have no foundation beyond themselves. And I tend to think that objective morality has a similar structure. You've got these basic moral axioms, and there isn't anything else that sort of makes them true. They don't really come from anywhere. And so you don't, the key point there is you don't need a God to make those axioms true. So that's kind of, I guess, the distinctive feature of my way of thinking of morality. Now, certainly there have been plenty of non-theists who have taken a view of morality that it's relative in some way, or perhaps that it's just completely an illusion, doesn't exist at all. But there's certainly, throughout history been plenty of non-theists, or at least folks who, even if they are theists, they don't think that objective morality needs a theistic foundation. So if we're looking for, some prominent historic figures who are sort of in my, broadly speaking, camp, I would point to people like Aristotle, for instance. I think would be in my camp. We could talk about that if we want to. Epicurus, another prominent Greek thinker. If we look outside of the Western tradition, I think Confucius would be in this category. These are all people who seemed to believe in real objective right and wrong, good and evil in some way, but didn't seem to think that it required a theistic foundation or background. So those would be some of the sort of folks, broadly speaking, in my camp, I guess you would say.
Yeah, and for me, similarly, my theory of morality, I refer to it as the Trinitarian Moral Theory, because I believe my position is that the Trinity, the Christian idea of the Trinity, that God exists as one being, but three persons in loving relationship with each other, that is the best explanation of objective morality. So it's kind of like, I use a silly example sometimes just to kind of help people understand what we're talking about. Let's say, we heard a knock on that door back there, and then we could all maybe get together and have a conversation and propose different theories of where that knock came from, or who was the one knocking. And so maybe somebody would say, well, that's Bob. I know it was him because he just texted me and said he was going to knock, and then that would be your theory. And then somebody else would propose maybe another theory and say, no, that's my sister, Sarah, and then so on and so forth. And so a similar thing is going on here with people like us who are moral realists. We believe that morality is objectively true. And then the next question is, well, what best explains that? Kind of like what best explains the knock behind the door? What best explains, or what's the best account of objective morality? And my position is that a God, an infinite, absolute creator God, in particular the Trinity, the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity, is that best explanation for objective morality. So this isn't a theory that's completely out of the blue, right? I mean, theists have argued that God is the best explanation of morality for centuries, if not thousands of years. So, and I would make the case that, even Plato, Aristotle, and then Christian thinkers throughout history, made that case that God, a theistic explanation, is the most plausible explanation for where objective morality comes from. But if you would narrow down, even among theists, if you would want to narrow down my theory, again, Trinitarian Moral Theory, it's probably most similar to this gentleman's moral theory. This is Robert Adams. He was a professor at Yale University for decades. I believe he's in retirement now, but this is one of his well-known books, Finite and Infinite Goods. And there's a sense in which my theory borrows a lot or is built on his foundation. I just bring what I see as truths about the Trinity to play in this theistic theory of morality. And the other big influence for me, the other big influence for my moral theory is this gentleman, John Hare, and he's written several books. This is just one of them. But John Hare is a professor at Yale right now. So those two are probably the biggest influences in terms of me building my moral theory.
So as for what you two disagree on, clearly the thing that you disagree on is the existence of God. Why do you think God does or does not exist? And Adam, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I became a Christian when I was around 17 years old. So when I was a teenager is when I trusted in Christ and became a Christian. But I didn't really encounter robust philosophical arguments for the existence of God until I was a student here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So, I grew up in a Christian home and I had doubts about the existence of God, but just It was one of those things I kind of took for granted and didn't think much about growing up. But when I was a student here in the mid-90s, I wasn't a philosophy student. I was in the business college studying actuarial science to be an actuary. I took just Philosophy 101 here at UNL, 1995, 1996 time period, under the philosophy professor we had here, Robert Audi. And Robert Audi was a philosophy professor here at UNL for a few decades, and now he's at Notre Dame. But it was in his philosophy class, he's a Christian, Robert Audi, but it was in his philosophy class that I first encountered robust philosophical arguments for God. And so I would say at this point in my life, I'm approaching mid-40s, and the reason why I still believe, that there is a God is because of these arguments. So to me, I find the two strongest arguments for the existence of God, the ones that I find most compelling, are the first one is sometimes it's called the teleological argument or the fine-tuning argument for God. I think that's probably the most powerful argument. I find it to be the most compelling. And the other one would be like an Aristotelian type argument, like a first cause argument. How did this all begin? Where did this all come from? The universe seems to have had a beginning. Everything that has a beginning needs a cause. And again, it's kind of it's that same abductive reasoning, that inference to the best explanation. Well, what best explains the existence of the universe? What best explains the existence of objective morality? What's the best explanation of, the fine-tuning that we see in the universe? And I think all those arguments point to, the most plausible explanation is that there is a supreme being that is the cause behind all of those things. So those are the reasons that I believe that there is an infinite being, there is a supreme being that exists. And it's interesting, as I've studied these arguments and seen so many cultures and different people groups throughout history come to the same conclusion, and oftentimes because of very similar arguments, teleological or cosmological arguments, that they arrive at this conclusion. And studying those, thinking about those pros and cons, arguments back and forth, those are what compel me to believe that there is a supreme being, a God.
So I would say this is a big question. I think the question of whether God exists is an extremely difficult question. You're trying to evaluate lots of different arguments. You're trying to consider a whole bunch of evidence and figure out what's the most plausible explanation, which way does all of the evidence together point. But if I have to give a short answer, so I guess I want to emphasize, I think it's definitely an issue where reasonable and sincere people can certainly disagree. I think it's the case with Adam and I. But the short answer is, so why did I end up where I did in the atheist side? And I think the short answer would be there are various arguments for God's existence, various theistic arguments. Adam described two of those just now. None of those, to me, and I guess not all of them together, seem decisive, compelling. There's a lot to be said about all of these arguments. It's sort of a huge topic unto itself. But one just sort of point to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. I think our universe is highly mysterious. And I certainly, so when the theist says, well, here's this weird, puzzling thing about our universe, and God would be the best explanation of that, it's not that I necessarily have some better explanation that I can point to. So I'm not one of those atheists who you may have seen who seems to think they have the answers to everything. I think there's just a lot of mystery. I guess I take the view that the God possibility is one possibility. I don't think we're in a position where it's reasonable to conclude that that's actually what's going on. I find reality to be highly puzzling and mysterious. The other argument or consideration that plays a role in my thinking is a very familiar one. The evil and suffering we find in our world, not just that there is evil and suffering, but the way that it's distributed, the kind of evil and suffering that exists. This is clearly nothing new. But I think when reflection on that leads me away from the idea of, in particular, a sort of, very good or morally perfect being that's in charge of the universe. Obviously, these are all large topics. My goal here is just to give you a sense of, how did I end up where I ended up.
Cool. And the last question for this section, what do you appreciate or respect about the other's position? And Erik, can I
I go first, yeah. So I appreciate at the sort of philosophical richness, I think, of Adam's position. Also, by the way, I think he's the first person who ever wrote a whole book engaging with my work. So, I mean, I really appreciate that. Thank you. But aside from that, his theory itself, it's just very interesting to think about. So as I think, as he mentioned in his remarks, he's taken Robert Adams' basic approach, but then really added some interesting modifications to it. So to me, there's a lot of richness that makes it interesting to sort of think about it, think about how it works, and so on. So I appreciate the depth and richness of his thought and his theory. And as perhaps this has come out already, I think I certainly also appreciate his approach to these matters, the sincerity and his emphasis on following reason and evidence. Again, I think that's something we have in common for sure.
Yeah, and like I mentioned before, I really appreciate Erik's approach in terms of, he wants to understand what's real. He wants to understand what's true, not just what he likes, not just what he feels is correct, but he wants to know what's true, and he's seeking that through, good reason and evidence. And I think that's the appropriate route that we should use to try to discover truth. So I appreciate that about him. I appreciate his philosophical work. Like I said, I was first introduced to it when I started my PhD studies, and just very quickly was attracted to it and appreciated it because of its thoughtfulness. Sometimes it's, especially engaging with people, sometimes they will just maybe brush off Christianity, or they will brush off any sort of theistic explanations. And he disagrees with theistic explanations, of course, but he doesn't dismiss them as silly or stupid, and engages with some of the top Christian philosophers in the world, like Robert Adams, and really thoughtfully engages with them and thinks through. And so that's one of the things that really impressed me right from the beginning with his work and his book. And I think it's caused me, and I've told him this many times, that his work has caused me to think more carefully about my position. And so these sort of conversations are so useful, when we have disagreements. And one of our goals tonight is that we would like to model, how to disagree respectfully over major issues like this. And in my conversations with him, and he's been super humble and respectful, and I've learned a lot from him, and it's caused me to think more deeply about my own position and think through maybe some weaknesses, or maybe I was too confident here or there, and it's helped me to hone in and better even understand my own position and to develop it in response to some of his critiques. So I love these sort of conversations, and I love having these conversations with people I disagree with. And I think both of us would have the aspiration, for the other one to change their mind. And I think that's appropriate in any context, whether it's a political context or philosophical context, or even a scientific context, where we're trying to defend our particular position. And you can do that. You can do that confidently, and you can do that with good reasons and evidence, and you can do that without being a jerk about it. So that's one thing that I really appreciate about Erik is his willingness to engage and to do so humbly and respectfully. And I try to do the same.
All right. That concludes the first portion of the event. I'd now like to invite one or two of our co-sponsors to share about what they do on campus.
Hello. Okay, you guys can hear me. Hi, my name is Jordan, and I am standing up here and talking to you about my group called Christian Student Fellowship, or CSF. We meet on Tuesday nights at 8 o'clock in the Union Auditorium. We are a group that of bunch of believers and seekers just to learn about the Bible and what it has to say, and just try to apply it to our lives and learn new things through it. And if you have any questions about tonight or whenever, we're an opportunity for an RSO that would love to have you come and ask questions, and we'll try our best to help you figure it out. So, Tuesday nights, 8 o'clock, City Auditorium, CSF. I'd like to see you there.
I just leave it.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Cavada, the UNL Philosophy Club president this academic year. Firstly, I'd like to thank Ratio Christie for putting on this wonderful event and allowing us to partner with them again. If you don't know about UNL Philosophy Club already, what we do every week is we talk about the various philosophical topics. This coming week, we're going to be talking about the ethical questions surrounding drug use. This semester, we're only meeting through Zoom from 6 to 8 on Fridays. If any of you all would like to get involved, please find me after the event, or you can find us through Involve You. Thank you all for coming.
All right, thank you, both of you. And just a reminder, if you have any questions for both of our speakers, you can just use the QR code or visit that website and put your questions up there. All right, for our next section, our guests will be asking each other questions. That'll be the exciting part. And Erik, we can have you go first.
I'm going to go first? All right. Let the respectful disagreement begin. Okay. All right, so first question, Adam. It seems that on your view, if I can set up this question a bit. One of the arguments I put forward, I mentioned before, on my view, I think there are these moral axioms that don't have a foundation outside of themselves, and they're kind of the basis of everything else. Objective morality rests on those. But another idea I have is that I think probably any theory that it says there's objective morality is going to have some moral axioms in there somewhere. And in particular, I think that any theistic theory is going to have some moral axioms, claims, statements that are accepted without a further explanation or source or ground. And this might be one of the things Adam and I disagree about. So I guess the significance of this is, if this is correct, then in a way, the non-theistic approach and the theistic approach, they're playing the same game. They're both ultimately appealing to foundational moral axioms at some point in their theory. And this, I think, is worth pointing out, because I do think it's sometimes suggested on the theistic side that the non-theist moral realist has a kind of problem that the theist doesn't have, which is they have these moral axioms or statements that just come from nowhere, whereas on the theistic side, everything is ultimately grounded in God. So one argument I make is, and this is to be discussed, which is explaining my position, I think the theist, if you look carefully, has the same sort of thing going on, so that there really isn't actually a deep difference there. Okay, the point of all that was to set up my question for Adam, which is related to that point. So the question is that now it seems on your view that the claim that the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity, that those relationships are good, seems perhaps to be one of these moral axioms, an ultimate stopping point that has no further explanation. Is that right? And if not, then what would explain the goodness of the love between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit? So not the love itself, but what makes that love good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this would be an area where we disagree. So I think a theistic explanation, at least my Trinitarian moral theory, doesn't have any ungrounded moral truths. And so I do affirm that my theory grounds all moral truth in God. And so this moral axiom that he's saying in my theory is ungrounded, I wouldn't see it that way. It doesn't seem to me to be an ungrounded moral truth. So according to my theory, the Trinitarian moral theory that I've proposed It's that God himself is the ultimate stopping point that has no further explanation. And I affirm there has to be some sort of an ultimate stopping point in reality. I mean, that's part and parcel of their Aristotelian first cause argument, that there's got to be some ultimate stopping point. And so I'm affirming that is God, the supreme being, and it's he himself that is the ultimate stopping point. And then certainly there are facts about God, right? So I'm affirming that God is, let's say, infinite, that he exists as three divine persons. I'm affirming, or at least part of my theory, is that he exists in these three loving relationships between Father, Son, and Spirit, Holy Spirit, so he's triune. So certainly there are facts about God, but it's not that the facts themselves are ultimate. The facts are just describing who and what God is, but it's God himself is what is ultimate. So more pertinent to his question, though, what makes their loving relationships good? This is how I would explain that. I would say, before anything else was created, before anything else existed, there was just God, right? So he's the ultimate stopping point, according to my theory. So God exists as these three divine persons in loving relationship with one another. And they have certain, if you will, ways that they treat each other. So they're kind to one another, they respect each other, they care for each other, they want what's best for each other, they're unselfish towards one another, and that's just how they treat one another. And you can refer to that however you want, and then, as humans, as we come along later, as I would understand it, he created us, human persons. We're persons, not divine persons, but human persons, and we refer to the way that God is by just calling that good. And maybe we learn that, maybe we learn what is moral good from our interactions, but then we discover that the ultimate good is what God is like.
All right. Adam, you can have the next question.
Okay, so Erik, one of the ways that you describe your theory is that it's non-natural. And I was just going to have you, if you would, kind of unpack that and explain what you mean by that it's non-natural. And my question for you would be, doesn't then that cause a lot of atheists to be uncomfortable or even reject your theory because of its non-naturalness? So if you could explain what that means and how you respond maybe to atheists who reject it because of that.
Yeah, so just brief context behind this question. I mean, a basic question you ask about reality is, what are its basic constituents? What does it contain? And in contemporary atheism, one popular position is what might be called materialism or physicalism, which just says, look, in the end, all there is to reality is physical stuff. You've basically got the natural physical universe. And even more than that, all the features of reality are ultimately physical in some sense, like they could be studied scientifically. So there's a form of contemporary atheism, this is just one form, which endorses what you might call scientism, which says basically science is the source of all knowledge. And for that to be the case, or science can give you knowledge of all reality. And for that to be the case, all reality would have to be physical in some sense, okay? So what Adam is getting at when he says that I characterize my theory as non-natural, I'm not a materialist, I'm not a physicalist, I reject this scientist approach, not science, but scientism rather. So I think there's more to reality, I think there's more to the universe than just physical stuff. I think there's more to reality than what can be studied or known through the methods of empirical science. And in particular, if you think about right and wrong and good and evil, on the face of it, those seem to be things that aren't really physical features of reality. So if you think about the water bottle, thrilling example I mentioned before, it's got various physical properties of mass, volume, and so on, other boring physical properties. And then you think about, you know, an action, for the example I mentioned before, torturing a baby just for fun, and we suppose that that action has this feature or aspect to it. It's wrong. It's immoral. It shouldn't be done. And it's really hard to see how that feature could be just a physical feature. It seems to be in a different fundamental category. And so when I characterize my view as non-natural, basically what I'm saying is that these moral, ethical features of things are not part of the natural physical world that could be studied empirically using the methods of science. So the other question was, yeah, does this lead some atheists to not accept my theory? The answer is yes. Those atheists are misguided. They're in the grip of scientism. They accept physicalism. The thing about atheism, though, it's very unorganized. Okay, we don't have an official sort of doctrine that we have to adhere to. There's, of course, within Christianity various debates and disagreements, but atheism is much more sort of out of control, and it's like the Wild West. So it doesn't particularly bother me that this particular type of atheism, this scientist, physicalist version, doesn't fit very well with my view of reality. You asked what I would say to those atheists in that camp. I mean, this is a sort of big debate, but there's kind of two things that lead me to this non-natural view. I mentioned before some of the reasons that lead me to think that objective morality is real. And then I just don't see any plausible explanation as to how it could be that right and wrong, good and evil, are literally physical features of things. So they seem real, they seem not to be physical, so they must be something else, their own fundamental category. That's what I mean when I call my view non-natural.
All right, thank you.
All right, is it my turn for another question?
Yes, it is.
Okay. All righty, so this next question has to do with a concept, intrinsic goodness and evil, just to set this up briefly. I think that certain things are good and evil, as we often say, in and of themselves. They're good or they're bad, and their goodness or badness does not come from anything outside of themselves. It's not derived from how they're related to anything other than themselves. It's just contained within themselves, I guess you would say. So certain kinds of love between human beings, I think, would have this intrinsic goodness. It's not just that these types of love are good, it's that they carry their goodness within themselves. So that's part of my sort of overall view of things. There are lots of, I think, intrinsic goods and evils in our world. And the things that are good and evil would be part of the natural world. It's just that the being good or being evil, that feature is not a physical property, just to sort of clarify. Okay, so the question for Adam is, as I just explained, I'd say that certain sorts of love between human beings are intrinsically good. They have their goodness inside themselves, not needing an external source. An example might be a mother's love for her baby. So the question is, on your view, without a triune God as the foundation of reality, of morality, would this sort of love, like a mother's love for her baby, would it have no value without God as the foundation? Yeah, there should have been a rise in my voice. That was the end of my question. Okay.
No, yeah, I follow. And for a theist, I think these sort of thought experiments can be very, very difficult. Because as he just mentioned towards the end of his question, my position is that God is the foundation not only of morality, but of all reality, right? And so I thought, you might remember Mark Murphy had this great response when Erik and I did a conference together in Boston a few years ago, and another Christian philosopher was there, Mark Murphy. He's a philosophy professor at Georgetown University. And I thought he had a great response, or just a great point here to make, that it's very difficult for a theist to imagine any reality existing if there was no God, right? So, to me, when I try to do these thought experiments of, okay, would love between a mother and her child have intrinsic value if there was no God? Well, according to my position, if there was no God, there would be no mothers and babies. And so it's difficult for me to think about these thought experiments because they're so they're so far removed from what I think is really real about reality. But I think it is beneficial to consider, for the sake of argument, if somehow, which to me seems incredibly implausible, that this universe could just be here, without God. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that we do live in such a universe, and there is no God to explain it. And for the sake of argument, in a situation like that, if that was even possible, which I don't think it is, but would there be somehow intrinsic moral value between the mother loving her baby in this example? So to me, my position is it's very difficult for me to see how that could be the case. To me, the most likely explanation, if there is no God, and this universe is here somehow, in some other way, it seems most likely to me then that these subjective feelings, I would have to side more with Charles Darwin and Richard Dawkins in that situation, who affirm, or their position is that these subjective feelings of love were just accidental adaptations of nature that then were selected by nature via the haphazard evolutionary process, selected by nature because they led to greater chances of survival and reproduction. Because if you think about it, a species that didn't love and take care of their offspring would not do as well and die out compared to a species that did. So if there is no God, that seems like a much more plausible explanation than these non-natural moral facts, if there is no God.
All right, Adam, you have the next question.
Okay, so one of the things we've been talking about already is what is the ultimate stopping point, right? And I think everybody has to have one, because one of the things you don't want in your theory is an infinite regress, right? You almost need some sort of an ultimate stopping point. And as a theist, and in particular as a Christian, I would say that God is that ultimate stopping point that doesn't have a beginning, that doesn't have an explanation, that he just is, he just exists. And every theory of reality seems to have some sort of an ultimate stopping point. So like for the naturalist, the atheist who believes in naturalism, they would just say that the universe, maybe, or the multiverse is the ultimate stopping point. There's nothing beyond that. That's ultimate reality, or that's the ultimate stopping point. And it seems to me, from best I understand your theory, is that it's these brute ethical facts that you propose is part of the ultimate stopping point. So I wanted to ask you more about these brute ethical facts, these ultimate moral axioms that you claim don't have any foundation, no explanation, and compare stopping points, all right? So if I'm proposing God is the ultimate stopping point, it sounds to me like Erik is proposing these moral axioms as the ultimate stopping point. So, if we're considering now these two ultimate stopping points, and on my side, I have these arguments for the existence of God, arguments for that God is the ultimate stopping point, teleological argument, cosmological argument, so on and so forth. So my question would be for you, what are your reasons and evidence to believe in the existence of these non-natural moral axioms? What reasons and evidence do you have to give us to believe that they are real?
Yeah, so two thoughts there. The general approach, right, why think that reality contains these moral axioms? And it goes back to some of the things Adam was saying earlier about, if you recall the example of knocking on the door, where we observe some phenomenon, or there's something that we think is true, and then we wonder what explains that, what's the best explanation for it. And that's the type of reasoning that leads me to posit these moral axioms. I was mentioning before, I described some reasons for thinking that there are these objective moral facts, and then there are various theories about how that could be. And to me, the most plausible option seems to be you've got some moral axioms that have no further source or explanation. So the issue of do theistic theories, I guess in this case Adam's theory in particular, does his theory involve similar moral axioms? I think that issue comes back up here. Because the other part of this argument is, I really think this is true of all theories. At some point they're going to have, any theory that says there's objective morality is going to have one of these moral axioms as part of it. I think it's very difficult, perhaps impossible to get away from this. And so to me, I guess I'm led to the position that if you think there's objective morality at all, you're going to be stuck with these moral axioms. And so you've got this sort of dilemma on your hands. Abandon objective morality, which seems implausible, or accept these moral axioms. And so given that, I think the reasonable conclusion is that there must be these moral axioms. Now again, I'll just sort of flag, that depends on this other disagreement between us about whether Adam's theory has these axioms in it. But if it does, that would be part of my argument for why we should believe in these axioms. Okay, and then it's my turn for a question, right?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so my next question is also, similarly, it's still on this topic of foundations, of moral axioms. All right, so Adam, a common question about views like yours is the following. What's the source of our moral obligation to obey God's commands? Now, if I understand your theory correctly, it seems that your answer goes something like this. It relates to the triune God. Because the Son obeys the Father, obedience to God is good, and hence we humans ought to obey God. So here's the question. Isn't there a difference, though, between goodness and obligation? They're related concepts, but they seem different. Obligation in particular has this mustness, this requirement to it, that goodness does not seem to have. So the specific question is, what gives obedience to God this mustness? What makes it a requirement, an obligation, rather than just being good?
Yep. And the background of his question here is he's trying to point out respectfully that there are moral axioms in my theory, whereas I want to say, no, there aren't any ultimate moral axioms, that God is the ground of all the moral truths that I'm proposing are grounded in God in some way, shape, or form. So that's a large part of what I'm trying to attempt to do in my theory, is to show how all moral truth is grounded in God, and there aren't any of these ungrounded moral truths. As he mentioned, just a little bit of a background, all ethical theories are trying to explain two things, at least two things, and those two things are, first, moral value, what gives something moral value, and then secondly, where does moral obligation come from? So sometimes it's presented as, your theory of moral value has to do with what's good and bad, and then moral obligation has to do with more what's your moral duties, like what's right and wrong. And you can see that the two things are related, but sometimes there's a divergence, right? So let's say, as a group, we could go and build an orphanage, right? And that would be a morally good thing to do, most would agree, but we're not obligated to do it, right? That's not something that we have to do. We're not obligated, but it would still be a good thing to do. So that's just a simple, quick example to give you a difference of these two aspects of morality that need to be explained. And yeah, he's correct. In my theory, I think has an advantage here in that moral obligation is grounded in moral value. So my theory, just like Robert Adams' theory, says that God is the ultimate good. He puts forth God as the ultimate exemplar, as the good, kind of like in a Platonic sense, God is the good. And then anything else is morally good if it resembles the exemplar. So things are morally good if they resemble God. And then I just add to that Trinitarian aspects of God. So in particular, what's being resembled is that love between the members of the Trinity. So something is morally good if it resembles those loving relationships. So part of what I'm saying is why obeying God is a good thing, because obeying God is akin or intertwined with loving God. And this is talked about a lot in the New Testament, about how loving God and obeying God are very intertwined. And so part of my theory is that obeying God is a good thing, moral obligation is a good thing because it resembles God. Again, in the Trinity, you've got the Trinitarian members loving one another, and so when we love God in our obedience of Him, we resemble Him. So that's what makes our obedience to God good.
All right, Adam, the next question is yours.
Okay, these brute ethical facts, or these non-natural moral axioms that you propose, they just don't seem like a good stopping point. And in fact, a lot of, I wanted to have you speak a little bit on just, sometimes you describe these brute ethical facts in Platonic terms, and I know this came up a lot with your debate with Craig. Would you still define or still be comfortable describing your theory as Platonic in that sense, or that you would describe them as abstract objects? So that would be the first part of the question. And then more what I'm getting at with that is, if that is in fact the case, these sort of things, abstract objects, these brute ethical facts that you propose, don't seem like a good stopping point in and of themselves. Because, in other words, they seem to be things that cry out for explanation. And in fact, when you look throughout history, most of the people that proposed such abstract objects, or abstract moral truths in this case, didn't see them as plausible stopping points. They seem to be the type of things that need an explanation themselves. Possibly, and probably even Plato himself, who proposed, these abstract objects, had a theistic explanation of them. And, Greg Welty, who we both know, and others actually build an argument for the existence of God from these abstract objects. They say, given that these abstract objects, moral truths, exist, the best explanation of abstract objects is that there's a God behind them in some way, shape, or form. So, I guess you can boil down my question into where did they come from? How can they exist? They don't seem to be a good ultimate stopping point.
Yeah. So there's a bit of complexity here. Bear with me. I'll try not to make it too complicated. But what's going on is there's a debate in philosophy about whether there has to be these sort of abstract objects, or could there just be things that exist that have different features. And so what I would say, what is essential to my view of things is that there are objects in the world that have, objectively speaking, have these moral features, ethical features. So for example, a mother's love for her child is intrinsically good. That's not an abstract object. That's a sort of concrete part of reality. It has this ethical property, this value of goodness. But that by itself, that thing itself is not an abstract object. So the philosophical debate is about, can there be particular things with properties and that's it, or do there also have to be some sort of abstract objects? So for example, if there are going to be, back to the world's most boring example, if there are going to be bottles that have, if there are going to be objects that have the property of being a bottle, does there also have to be such a thing as like the abstract feature or property of bottleness or bottlehood or something like that? This is how philosophers talk, okay? Can there just be bottles, or does it have to be some other non-physical entity? Maybe if you're like, what the hell's happening, maybe try numbers, okay? Do you ever think about just numbers themselves, the number 3, all right? What the hell is that thing? Okay? It doesn't seem to be a symbol you write on the board. Maybe if you hate math, you would like to annihilate all numbers, and you would go around and like erase the number 3 wherever you could. But even if you erased every single occurrence of that number, would you really have annihilated the number 3 itself? No, the thing seems indestructible. You can't get rid of calculus, okay? It seems to have some other kind of existence. So there's this huge debate. What's going on with numbers? What's going on with bottles? Does there have to be bottlehood? Does there have to be an abstract entity, number 3, for example? Or can there just be stuff with features? Okay, that's the big debate. In my book, when I presented my theory, I happily held myself to the existence of these abstract entities. But if you don't think we need those things, then I'm happy to go without them as well. Because again, what I think is essential are objects in the world that have these real moral features, good and evil, right and wrong. So if there can be love that's intrinsically good without there being such a thing as the abstract feature of love, just like there perhaps is no abstract, number 3 or something like that, then I'm perfectly happy to go along with that. So I think the upshot here is I'm not sure if whether my theory needs these things or not depends on this other debate in philosophy. And if the other debate in philosophy turns out so that we don't need these abstract entities, then I'm happy to give them up. In the end, what I think is important and real are particular objects in our world with features like good and bad, right and wrong, that don't have an external source or a theistic source for their rightness, wrongness, good and bad. There's more to be said, but I'm out of time. Okay. And I have the next question? Right, okay. Okay, so here this question is shifting gears a bit. It's not related to the moral axiom so much. Yeah, it's specifically about your view on whether you think in order for there to be moral obligations, there has to be accountability along with that. And in your book, it seems sometimes that you made that link. So for example, at one point you said this: in an impersonal universe with no personal authority at the head of the moral kingdom, there is no one we would be guilty before and accountable to. So this really is primarily a clarification question. On your view, would you say that we're morally obligated to do something only if we'll somehow get in trouble or be punished for not doing that thing?
Yeah, and I appreciate this question. It gives me an opportunity to explain a little bit more about my theory and my theory of moral obligation in particular. So, no, I probably wouldn't phrase it exactly that way. So I'll try to, explain as best I can how I would phrase it in my theory, my Trinitarian Moral Theory, how I view obligation. So, my understanding is that the driving force behind our moral obligation is that God created us to be lovers, to love Him and to love others. So even, Jesus said the greatest commandments, right, the greatest 2 commandments are to love God and love others, and all the rest of the commandments are based on that foundation. So my understanding of reality is that God created us as human beings, human persons, with the intention to love God and to love others. And that's the ultimate driving force behind our obligations. That's what God created us to do, to love Him and to love others, and that generates our obligations. And as I said before, obeying God is just part and parcel of that. So another strong connection that's made in the New Testament is our obedience of God is the way that we express our love to Him. And even to the point sometimes where the loving God and obeying God are intertwined or almost synonymous. So us loving God is the way we go about that is by obeying Him. So that's what generates ultimately our obligations. I will also say that according to my theory, the way that I understand reality is that God also, beyond being 3 divine persons in loving relationship with each other, He's also the moral judge of the universe. And so, yes, as the ultimate moral judge, the ultimate moral authority, there is a sense in which we are accountable to Him in that regard. So I think it would be appropriate, just like a human judge, to punish evil, to not let people get away with things. I think it's appropriate in the role that God plays as the judge of the universe to, yes, definitely hold us accountable and punish evil. And I think that is His, the role that He plays. I mean, what would we think of a judge, a human judge, that would let murderers, rapists go free and not hold them accountable to that. So that is definitely part of the role I see God playing in reality, is being the ultimate judge of the universe. And, obviously part of most all Christian theology is that we're all guilty before him in one way, shape, or form. We've all done something, at least one thing, morally wrong, and so we're accountable to him and deserve to, his punishment for our evil. But God has provided us, forgiveness from our moral choices, our bad moral choices, by sending his son, obviously, to die on the cross for our sins, and then promised anybody who would trust in him, put their faith in him, would be forgiven of their bad moral choices.
All right, it looks like, Adam, you have the final question for this segment.
Okay. So one of the major objections to your theory, and theories like yours, is referred to as the lucky coincidence objection. So let me set this up a little bit here. And this is an objection that many different folks have proposed against theories like Wielenberg's. Not just theists, but atheists have proposed this objection to his theory. And it is often referred to as the lucky coincidence objection. So here's how it goes. Let me set up the objection, and then I want to give Erik the opportunity to respond to this objection to his theory. So the objection goes like this. Basically it says, look, if there are such objective moral truths that exist out there somehow in a non-theistic way, so not saying that God is the ground of them, that they're out there in some way, shape, or form, beyond naturalism, beyond the physical world, because as he said, he's not a naturalist. So these non-natural facts, if they do exist out there, how is it that we've come to know them, right? If they exist objectively, how did we come about, especially, and this is a problem that goes back a long ways in philosophy, when people have posited these Platonic truths out there, how can we know them? But I think this is exacerbated, or this problem is amplified for a position like Wielenberg's, when he affirms that our moral beliefs have come about through a haphazard evolutionary process. So it seems like quite a lucky coincidence if our, moral beliefs have come about, in his theory, from this haphazard evolutionary process to somehow, luckily, match up with the objective moral truth that he's proposing. Because, for example, even like Charles Darwin said himself, if our evolutionary path would have gone differently, we would have ended up with vastly different moral beliefs, maybe like beeves or wolves. And so then, how is it that we got so lucky our evolutionary path led us to believe these so-called objective moral truths that exist out there?
Yeah, okay, it's a good one, a big one. All right, 3 minutes. Okay, so short answer, the super short answer is I think there's not as much luck or chance involved in getting our beliefs and the moral truths to line up as the objection is suggesting. To explain why, the hard part, I guess. Here's some thoughts about this. So what we have are a lining up, a coincidence perhaps, between two things. On the one side, we've got these basic moral truths, let's say, the moral axioms. On the other side, we've got human moral beliefs. I mean, one thing is that clearly I don't think they line up perfectly. Human beings, there's enough disagreement that some people are wrong. But I think but the challenge is how to account for whatever lining up does exist. And by the way, the background here is, on the theistic view, you have a nice explanation. God makes it so that they line up, okay? But I don't have that explanation, right? So how can I account for this lining up? So I think on the one side, on the axioms, part of my idea is that these are necessary truths. They really couldn't have been, different. So they're sort of fixed. It's not as if there's some probability of those being different than what they are. Just as on the theistic view, the existence of God is typically taken as a necessary truth. It's not that there's an 80% chance that God exists and it turned out that he does. It's like, no, things couldn't be any other way. I think these moral axioms are like that as well. So on that side, there really isn't any chance. They're just, that's how they have to be. The variability then would be on the belief side. And I think that what generates human moral beliefs is going to be a combination, unsurprisingly, of nature and nurture. I think our human minds were shaped significantly by evolutionary processes, in my view, not guided by God. That's a crucial factor, a big difference. And then culture and individual experience shapes our moral beliefs as well. But here's to try to give you a sense of how evolutionary processes might be less chancy. They might lead us, than the objection suggests, they might lead us in a certain direction. It's going to be very evolutionarily advantageous for each individual being that can form beliefs and moral beliefs to recognize or hold certain beliefs about themselves, like that their own pain is really bad, or that they have certain rights, that they ought not to be exploited or enslaved or treated in horrific ways, okay? Holding those beliefs is going to make you more likely to survive and reproduce. It's also very helpful, not necessarily in this context, but it's very helpful for us to generalize in a certain way and recognize, okay, if entity X has a certain feature and the other things are like X, then they probably have that feature as well. That's just a very handy principle of reasoning. And so evolution is unsurprisingly, could probably make us so that we reason that way. My time is up, but I have to put it all together, otherwise the suspense will be killing all of us. You combine them, and it goes like this. Evolution makes it advantageous for you to recognize the evil of your own pain or that you have certain rights. And then this other way of reasoning inevitably leads you, whether you like it or not, to realize, damn it, these other people are just like me, and so their pain is probably bad, and they probably have the same rights that I do. And now you're often headed in the direction of moral truth. My time is up.
All right, that concludes the second portion of the event. I believe we have one more co-sponsor to share what they do on campus.
Hey guys, glad to see you guys here. I am not actually with Christian Grad Fellowship. They weren't able to have somebody here to introduce their group. I'm actually with Ratio Christi, but I'm going to be telling you guys a little bit about Christian Grad Fellowship. It's a group for grad students here on campus. Right now they're meeting every Monday at 7 p.m. They are specifically geared toward grad students in that they want to provide an environment for those doing additional research in deeper fields of study to come together and contribute to their discussions. Right now they are studying through C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. So they're meeting again every Monday, 7 p.m. for those of you who are interested. You can find out more on Facebook, Christian Grad Fellowship at UNL, if you're interested in joining them, or you can reach me, talk to me after the event here, and I can get you connected with them. But definitely want to thank them for their participation in helping sponsor this event.
All right, thank you, Ben. All right, so the next section is the Q&A. So again, if you have a question that you haven't put in yet, we have the QR code and the website on the screens. But let's go ahead and get started with the ones we have. And this first question is to both of you. Assuming your moral theory is true, what method should we use to determine the objective answers to new moral questions?
Who goes first?
Eric, let's go ahead.
Oh, darn. Okay. When I was speaking before, obviously I was talking about these moral axioms, and I mentioned the case of geometry, I think ethical reasoning is in some ways like math. You start with basic principles that seem plausible, and then you apply them to particular situations. And so I think, is this right? Was the question specifically about like new moral questions that might arise? Yeah. So the short answer is I think you're gonna take those same, in some cases, old principles and simply try to apply them to the new situations. Obviously, this is often difficult to do, but I think that would be the way to go about it. So, if you know, a lot of moral reasoning is applying principles to situations. If you get new situations, you can try to apply those principles to the new situations. Short answer.
Yeah, and I don't think my answer would be much different than that. I appreciate this question though, because one of the reasons why sometimes people will reject objective morality is they will say, look, there's so much disagreement about moral issues, and different individuals disagree, different cultures disagree, and so they conclude from that fact of disagreement that there is no objective moral truth. And I think that goes too quickly. I don't think that's the appropriate conclusion from that. I mean, just think about any field, and you guys are all studying different fields here at the university, and no matter what field you're studying, there's disagreement in it, right? Whether it's science or history or philosophy, you're always going to find disagreement, right? But because there's disagreement, that almost assumes that there is an objective truth, and you just disagree on what that objective truth is. So disagreement itself doesn't mean that there isn't objective truth. It just means we might not know what that objective truth is yet. And it works the same way, I would see, and I think Erik does as well, in morality, that there is objective moral truth, but we're not saying it's always easy to know what that is. It can be very difficult. Just like it is in archaeology or science or any field, sometimes it's difficult to know what is objectively true. That doesn't mean there isn't an objective right or wrong answer. It can just mean it's difficult to know what it is sometimes. So the question comes, well, then how do we know? How do we work at, or how do we try to discover or ascertain what is morally true in a particular circumstance? And I would affirm it's the process that Erik referred to. Moral reasoning, I think, is a huge part of that. So as a Christian, here's how I understand reality works. So my understanding of reality is that God has revealed truth to us in two different ways. Sometimes theologians talk about it in terms of general revelation and special revelation. And general revelation is just, truths that God has revealed to us, let's say through his creation, right? Or just generally he reveals truth to us. So we can learn, philosophical truth, logic, mathematical truth. I would say, a large part of moral truth we can learn and discover through moral reasoning, just like we can discover things about the world through our reasoning and logic and our ability to understand things. So that's general revelation. And then, Christianity, like a lot of theistic belief systems, would affirm that there is special revelation, that God has revealed certain things to us directly, maybe even verbally, direct revelation. So those would be the two ways that God has revealed truth to us. So part of general revelation is that God has revealed things to us about moral truth in a general sense. That's why I would not say that somebody needs to believe in Christianity or somebody even needs to read the Bible to know right from wrong, because that is part of God's general revelation, that we all can know right from wrong because he's revealed it to us generally in general revelation, and we don't need special revelation to know some of these basic moral truths.
All right. Our next question is also directed to both of you. What evidence or reason would you find sufficient to make you change your mind on the existence of the Christian God? And Adam, let's have you start.
Yeah, reason and evidence. right? I mean, that's my short answer is, I do my best to base all of my beliefs on good reasons and evidence. And my positions on various things have changed throughout my life based on new information, new reasons, new evidence that's presented to me. So, as a younger person, struggling with, is there really a God? Does God really exist? I wanted to understand both arguments. I wanted to understand both positions and see, the best reasons and evidence that they had to offer. And that's what caused me, especially in my late 20s, to try to discover these things. What are the best arguments for God? What are the best arguments against God? And, to be open to where the truth would lead. And so trying to discover as best we can, like I said before, not that it's always easy to know what's true, whether it's scientific truth or historical truth or whatever the type of truth it is. Truth is just, my understanding of truth is just whatever corresponds to reality. So if you're trying to discover the truth, I think there's certain ways that we have to go about that. And it's through reason and evidence and looking at what's plausible, what makes sense, what's the best reasons and evidence. And so, I would say no matter what my position is, theological positions, scientific positions, I am willing to change them, based on the best reasons and evidence. And from, my study of this particular issue, whether God exists or not, I've just been compelled by the good reasons and evidence I've encountered that there is a God. So that's why I base my belief on that.
Yeah. So, if you understand this question as like a psychological question, like Wielenberg, what are some scenarios or stuff that could happen to you where you would become a Christian? I'm not exactly sure where those limits are. I don't know if I know myself well enough, but maybe that's not really what the question is asking. I can, of course, I think describe scenarios that would be quite compelling, like scientists discover a new subatomic particle that's throughout the universe and it has "made by God" stamped on it in teeny-weeny letters. Okay, that seems pretty compelling. That might move the needle significantly. Perhaps a more serious answer, though, gets at what, in my thinking, is kind of one of the big obstacles or stumbling blocks, I suppose. And I touched before on evil, the nature of suffering and evil in our world. And so I guess to my way of thinking, what would make a big difference is a strong indication or reason to believe in the goodness of a being that's in charge of our universe. And I think on the theistic side, Adam, for example, is probably thinking, well, there is, good reason for that. We obviously disagree about that, but I think one way of giving hopefully a useful answer to the question is, I would, if there was what I thought as a compelling reason to think the universe was being run by a morally perfect being, that would make a big difference in my way of thinking.
All right, thank you. Our next question is directed to Dr. Wielenberg. What is the downside for breaking a moral law? And must morality be objective for those downsides to exist?
Yeah, so I think this is related to the accountability issue that came up before. I had a question for Adam about that. So I don't think that it's built into reality that if you act immorally, you will somehow get in trouble. I don't think there's any guarantee in the universe. And in fact, I think people get away with stuff, maybe a lot. But I think my view is that the question of morally should I do this and will I get in trouble if I don't do this are distinct questions. And it can very well be the case that, yes, I morally ought to do this. I would be acting immorally if I didn't do this. But at the same time, I won't get in trouble. It seems to me to be perfectly conceivable. In fact, I think there are a lot of situations like that in reality. So I don't think in order for there to be objective right and wrong or obligation, that there has to be accountability built into it, or that you'll get in some sort of trouble if you don't follow your obligations. Whether there's a downside to acting immorally, in my view, depends on human beings. So in my view of things, it's extremely important for human beings to do their best to try to set up the world so that doing what's right tends to be beneficial and doing what's wrong tends not to be beneficial. But it's up to us. And I think the obligations are there whether or not we do that. And there is no guarantee that that's how the universe is going to be set up. So, is there necessarily a downside? No. It's up to human beings to make it so that there's a downside.
All right, Adam, I guess, do you have anything to add to that or rebuttal for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to see how we could be obligated to these facts. So, a big part of my theory is that, like Robert Adams, I would affirm that our moral obligations arise in our social relationships. So, because it just seems like, we're morally obligated to other persons, not impersonal things. So, like, I don't have any moral obligation to this bottle of water. I mean, if I threw it at one of you, right, then it would enter the moral dimension because now it's with another person, right? But just, impersonal things don't seem to have a moral dimension to them. So it seems like our moral obligations arise in our social relationships, or maybe I should say our personal relationships. So it's hard for me to see, it seems very unclear to me how we could have moral obligations to these moral axioms or brute ethical facts that Erik is proposing. I mean, how could those things generate our moral obligations? And those just seem like facts. How could principles or moral principles or facts generate our obligations? It seems more plausible to me that we're in some sort of a social relationship with a supreme being, and that's ultimately where our moral obligations come from or arise from. And certainly we have moral obligations from our personal relationships with each other, but it seems like humanity at large, to generate ultimate moral obligations, there needs to be a divine relationship that we're in with to generate those obligations beyond just our human to human relationships.
Right. Our next question is directed at Dr. Johnson. Your belief in Christianity is deeply rooted in a belief in the Trinity. However, Christianity entails belief in many other things as well, like the authenticity of the four Gospels. If these non-Trinity related Christian claims were proven to be false, would you still hold your Christian belief in the Trinity? Why or why not?
Repeat the last part or the actual question again, I'm sorry.
So if these non-Trinity related Christian claims, like the authenticity of the four Gospels, were proven to be false, would you still then hold to the Christian belief in the Trinity?
Oh, okay. Yep. So maybe just more of my epistemological approach or more of my understanding of how reality works is, as I said before, my understanding is that God reveals things to us generally through general revelation, and then he also reveals things to us via special revelation, speaking directly to us in some way, shape, or form. The most common example would be Scripture, right? Inspiring people to write his word, Scripture, we call the Bible. So, yes, the Trinity is one of those things that I don't think can be discovered or known about through general revelation. So there's a lot of things that God reveals to us generally, even some basic moral truth. We can use our reason to ascertain the world around us and do science and discover all sorts of things via general revelation. But there are some things that we just would not know about God unless he directly told us about himself. So I'm going to take a step back. In general revelation, I think we can know several things about God. So we can know that there is a supreme being. I think we can know some attributes about what God is like. And that's why I said before, it makes sense to me that a lot of cultures throughout history have come to the similar conclusion, whether it's Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, or various other cultures, people groups throughout history have come to this conclusion that there is a supreme being. He's most likely morally perfect. He's the creator, so on and so forth, because those sort of things can be known generally. But I don't think that we would be able to know that God exists as a Trinity, three divine persons in loving relationship with each other, unless God directly told us that about himself through direct communication, i.e., special revelation. So yes, to answer the question, if I would become convinced that, for instance, the New Testament really wasn't from God, again, I base my belief on that on good reasons and evidence. My approach would be very similar to John Locke. You might know of John Locke as a philosopher during the Enlightenment period. But my argument or my reason for believing the New Testament really is from God, or that Jesus really was the Messiah, really is God, is very similar to John Locke's approach, and what has convinced me that the New Testament really is from God. But if, based on good reasons and evidence, I would reject that belief or come to the conclusion that the New Testament really isn't from God, then yeah, the content that the New Testament says, including the Trinity, I would no longer believe. That's kind of a long, convoluted answer to that question, but that's how I base my beliefs on the Trinity.
All right, Dr. Wielenberg, is there anything you would want to add to that?
I don't think so.
All right. This next question is for you. So, for Dr. Johnson, it's God that defines what is right and wrong. Who defines right and wrong for you? There are some who might consider torturing a baby is right, for example.
Yeah, so I think this goes back to earlier Adam was talking about disagreement. And what does that sort of tell us about whether they're objective truths? Yeah, so who or what defines reality? So I've mentioned this sort of I think there's some similarities, obviously not perfect, but similarities between maybe moral thinking, moral reasoning, and mathematics. So it might be useful to reflect on the question, if you think of the axioms of geometry, well, who says these are the axioms? Who defines them? And there, I think it's plausible to say that nobody. It's just the nature of things. These are the principles that seem obviously true, so we start with those and go from there. We don't look to the judge of math to give us, to hand down the principles. We do our best as human beings to start with what seems obvious and plausible and then work from there. And I think that's what we should do when it comes to morality as well. I think part of the question maybe was along the lines of what would you do or what would you say to someone who's, you meet someone and they think it's perfectly okay to torture babies just for fun. They seem sincere. You can't talk them out of it. What do you do? What do you say? I don't know. What do you say if you meet someone who thinks that 2 + 2 = 5 and they seem sincere and you can't talk them out of it? Or some other, fundamental truth of mathematics? I don't know. Should it lead you to seriously question whether 2 + 2 = 4? I don't think so. And I think it's the same with something like torturing babies just for fun. It's obviously wrong. If I met someone who really didn't see that, I don't know what argument I would give. Arguments run out, and at a certain point, we have to go with what seems plausible and obvious to us. It's true in mathematics. I think it's true in morality as well.
Dr. Johnson, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I appreciate that Erik keeps using mathematics as a similar example, because I think that works. right? That there are objective mathematical truths just like there are objective moral truths. But I would ask the same question about mathematical truth. You know, it doesn't seem like it's something that is an ultimate stopping point. In fact, it seems like mathematical truth needs some sort of an explanation or needs some sort of a foundation from where it comes from and how it can exist. And I'm not the only one. I mean, there are many thinkers throughout history who have made a case for the existence of God from the existence of mathematical truth. So numbers, mathematical truths, where did those come from? How can they exist? And then they make the case that the best explanation for mathematical truth is that there is an ultimate supreme being as the source and foundation of that mathematical truth. It just seems very odd to me that whether it's moral truth or mathematical truth can just be there on its own without any source or foundation, without any explanation. It just is there. And that sort of intuition is the beginning of argumentation here, right? If these are the type of things that don't seem to be a good ultimate stopping point, that seem to cry out for explanation, then that's caused philosophers and thinkers throughout history to say, okay, well, where do these mathematical truths come from then? Or where do these moral truths come from? And it seems to me the best explanation is that there is a supreme being, a personal supreme being, that's the source of both of those types of truths.
All right, our next question is to Dr. Wielenberg. Should we base our laws and legal system on moral goodness? And if so, why?
It obviously, I think what's, good and bad, right and wrong is clearly relevant to what our laws should be. I think the difficult question is, how much of a role should it play? And I'm not sure. I mean, I guess to me this kind of seems like a sort of question, about what the law should be like. I haven't thought super deeply about it, to be honest. Just to give you a sense of like what some of the complexity might be. On the one hand, I think we often have the thought, well, this is immoral, somebody should put a stop to it, it should be illegal. On the other hand, we often have the thought that the government should get out of our lives a bit more. And these two thoughts often collide. And I think one of the difficult things in a legal system, one difficult thing, is trying to balance those two considerations, right? So, it's pretty bad, it's immoral if, I don't know, you're in love with someone and they just cheat on you and then treat you very coldly and make fun of you, let's say. Okay, there's a hypothetical example. Do we want that to be illegal? On the one hand, it's like, yeah, this is terrible. This person should go to jail. They should be punished for doing that. On the other hand, think about the police state and the government interference in our personal lives that would be required to enforce such a law. Okay, we have like relationship police getting involved now, investigating and so on. All right. So I think that's just some of the complexity. These are some of the things we're trying to balance. So maybe at least I can say this much. I mean, there's a big gap between this is bad, this is wrong, to this should be illegal. There's a lot of complexity there. What would be required to enforce such a law, and so on. But so I guess I'm just sort of explaining why I don't have a simple answer to this question. I think it's a complicated answer. I think the moral stuff is relevant, but there are other things that matter as well. That's the best I can do.
And Dr. Johnson, would you have anything to add to that?
I don't think so. I mean, I would affirm everything he just said. It can be very difficult. We don't want to make everything that we think is immoral, we don't want to make illegal. So in our legal system or in our understanding of things, it is good to distinguish between things that are immoral and things that are illegal. And sometimes those two things overlap, obviously. We would want to make rape something that is illegal. It's immoral, but we also would want to make it illegal. But there's other situations. I think he brought up a good one of maybe cheating on a loved one. Probably don't want to make that illegal, though I think most people would affirm that it's objectively immoral. And so it can be very difficult. And whenever, the way I understand government and society is whenever you have a group of people, they living together, whether it's on an island or in a country or in a household, you have to get together and think through these issues and how much legal authority are you going to put into the governing group, so to speak, or what is the governing group even going to look like, and how much authority are you going to give them, and what type of laws are they going to be able to create or not. I mean, this is all the beginning of legal theory and political theory, right? So I would affirm these are difficult questions and important things to think through. And even if the answers aren't easy to discover, I think there are answers out there, objective, true answers that we can struggle towards and try to figure out. And to, when we do disagree on these issues, to do it, humbly and respectfully, because that seems to be the way that we can get at truth better, when we have these conversations lovingly, respectfully, and really listen to one another instead of just screaming at each other.
All right. This next question is directed to Dr. Johnson. Since you say God is the authority on what is moral, would he say something is right for one person and wrong for another? What about Christian liberty? And does this go against objective morality or leave a gap in God's consistency?
Yeah, so if I could talk just for a minute about, my theory of moral obligation stems from the fact, like I said before, we should love God. That's what he created us for, to love him, and we do that through obedience. And so, he tells us things to do, call them commands, however you want to refer to it, and then our obedience of his commands is the way that we express our love for him. And so the question, I think, is getting at, well, could God command different people to do different things? And I think for sure. I think there's, in my whole theory, my Trinitarian Moral Theory, I try to describe 3 different categories of commands that God could give us. And some of the commands he gives us aren't necessarily tied to his moral, loving nature. So I think even Erik brought up the example before of driving on the left side or the right side. It seems like I could imagine a situation, not that this has happened, but I could imagine a situation where God commands or instructs a certain group of people to drive on the right side of the road, but then for whatever reason, maybe in another culture or another place, commands them to drive on the left side of the road. Because that activity in and of itself isn't good or bad, right? And God might have reasons why he instructs 2 different societies to drive on different sides of the road, maybe because it provides certain standardization and safety for that particular society. And so God commanding those 2 different things would generate different obligations for those 2 groups of people. So there are some commands that I would refer to as neutral commands in that respect. And that's how I understand a lot of the Old Testament laws. So you might be familiar with some of the Old Testament laws are about what food to eat or how to dress, how to cut your hair. And for whatever reason, God gave the Israelites very certain commands that, a lot of these things weren't good or bad in of themselves, but maybe he had good reasons to command them, more of these neutral type commands that later he could change, right? And so as Christians, our understanding is that in the New Testament, God has said a lot of those commands I give the Israelites don't apply to you. And it's not as though God has changed morality, but it's that these type of commands at least were neutral commands. So then I think the appropriate question to ask, well, are there some commands that God just couldn't change, right? And some of you who are philosophically oriented might recognize that I'm heading towards the Euthyphro dilemma, which I don't have the time to set up. But bottom line, I would say, yes, there are some commands that God could not change or command differently because they would violate his own moral loving nature. So the two primary ones, of course, would be to love God and to love others. I don't think God could change those, so to speak, or command the opposite. That he, because of his own moral loving nature, would have to command by necessity to love him, to love God, and to love others. So there's different types of commands, and they're related to his moral loving nature differently.
All right, unless there's anything you'd like to add, we can go on to our next question.
Can I take a minute to add something?
Sure, go ahead.
Briefly. So let me just, okay, I'm getting some time. All right, 2 minutes. So I just want to say a bit about how I see the relationship between divine commands and morality. I mean, one thing I should point out, my theory of morality, as I understand it, doesn't require the existence of God, but at least in my view, it doesn't rule out the existence of God. And so suppose God does exist, I do think that God's commands would be one source of moral obligation. I tend to think that, but I just don't think it's the only source. So, and I don't know if Adam takes this view, but some people in the hold what's called the divine command theory view, where they think God's commands are the only source of moral obligation. And my view would be if God exists, they're one source, but they're not the only source. And maybe one possible mistake that people might fall into is thinking, okay, this would be an important source of moral obligation. Therefore, all obligations come from that source, divine commands. So just to flesh it out with a simple example, suppose on your way over to this talk tonight, you passed another student who's there and their arm is on fire and they're upset as one would be, and there's a big bucket of water next to them and no one else is around, and you could easily take the bucket and douse their arm. I think right there you've got the ingredients for moral obligation. You've got pain, which is a great evil. You've got you, who could easily prevent the great evil with no real cost to yourself. You're the only one who can really do anything. I think that is enough to create strong reasons for you to help this person and put out the fire, and that you've got moral obligation there already. Now suppose we add in a God who commands us to love our neighbors, which putting this person's arm out would seem to fall under that. That might add something to the situation, but I don't think that factor is what makes the difference between no obligation and obligation. And I'm not actually asking us to imagine that there is no God here. I'm just saying, whether there's God there or not, if you just focus on the features of the situation, there's enough there already to make it that an obligation exists. There doesn't have to also be this further being in the picture in order to generate a real moral obligation.
All right. And our last question is directed at Dr. Wielenberg. Christianity teaches that people are more valuable than animals because we are God's image bearers. Do you distinguish between people and animals in this way, and if so, why?
Yeah, so I do think there are moral distinctions to be drawn between human beings and non-human animals. Obviously, I don't think that distinction has to do with humans being created in God's image. So what is the basis of that distinction? Well, I think it's simply that human beings have certain capacities, and not just intellectual capacities, but emotional capacities, and so on, that give our lives more value, and perhaps give us more value than the non-human animals. So I do accept this somewhat old-fashioned view of a kind of hierarchy of beings, where human beings would be above the non-human animals. I don't think the non-human animals count for nothing, morally speaking. I think they just count less. And so the distinction, I mean, there's this kind of, maybe you can see a theme emerging here. For me, the basis of all this stuff is in the things themselves, not the sort of outside source. So, and I guess I would say one thing that I think makes the Christian idea of human beings being created in God's image plausible in the first place is that we already realize that there are important differences between human beings and non-human animals. It's not as if that never occurs to us and then Christianity comes along and says, oh, we're created in God's image, and now we realize that we're somehow different. The differences are already there to be seen, and it's the differences themselves that create the moral difference, the difference in value, not the alleged fact, I think, that we're created in God's image.
Yeah, and I get a couple minutes to wrap it up.
Yep.
Okay. I just want to thank Dr. Wielenberg for being a part of this. I really appreciate his friendship and the time that he spent just talking to me about these issues and helping me understand his position and pushing against my position. It has been helpful because it's caused me to think more deeply about my own position and refine it. So I'm very thankful that he was willing to come to University of Nebraska and engage in a dialogue like this. But just following up on this last question, that would be, part and parcel of why I think his theory doesn't work, because, as he said, there's something more valuable about human beings that makes us maybe more morally valuable in some way, shape, or form. And he talked about it as being cognitive faculties and other things about us that make us more valuable than other animals. I'm trying to quote him accurately. But I just don't see, again, if I'm going to, for the sake of argument, imagine a universe where there is no God and we developed as human beings down this haphazard evolutionary path with no direction, and there were certain adaptations that nature selected that took us down our evolutionary path. I don't know those cognitive faculties or whatever those adaptations were. I don't know how those accidental adaptations came about would be more valuable than other adaptations. So without a God, and in this particular, for the sake of argument, alternative universe, why our cognitive faculties make us more morally valuable than, say, opposable thumbs or the adaptations that cockroaches evolved into so that they could best thrive. It doesn't seem like there's anything there that would make one more valuable than the other in such a scenario like that.
All right, that looks like that concludes our event. Thank you both, and especially Dr. Erik Wielenberg. Thank you for coming down to Nebraska to have this conversation. We love to have events like this and to be able to discuss openly about these kinds of topics. So if you're interested, let's see, in the book that we're selling still, A Debate on God and Morality, we'll be selling those at the book table right over there. Also, Ratio Christi, the organization that's facilitating this event, meets every Wednesday at Adam Johnson's house. We've been meeting off campus. And so this semester, the topic for this semester is on morality, of course, and morality and ethics. How can we know what is morally right? And so we'll be discussing various topics of ethics in the upcoming weeks. Things like, there'll be abortion, racism, and stem cell research are among some of the topics that we'll be talking about. So highly can be controversial, but also very interesting topics to discuss and very important ones as well. So if you're interested in those types of conversations, feel free to get in contact with us. So yeah, we thank you for coming, and we wish you a very good evening. Thank you very much.